So I've gone ahead and just created a new material up in File, New Substance, and I just set the graph name to yarn, and I made sure to set the size mode to relative to parent. So in our graph here, you can also change the parent size whenever you want if you set it to relative to parent. And if you didn't do that in the first place and you accidentally set it to absolute, if you just double click anywhere in your graph, you can come up to your output size and you can just change your parameters here. So what I want to do is I want to start off by creating our base material so that we can visualize what we're doing in our 3D node here. I'm going to double click on that guy, and I'm going to come over and I'm going to make sure that we set this to dielectric, and I just want to be able to see our normal map and our height map and be able to plug it in from our textures once we get creating our 3D mesh here. So to start off, I'm just going to create a normal node, and I'm going to plug that guy into our normal. And I'm going to right click on our base material node here, and I'm just going to go up to view in 3D. So now we're going to see our base material here as our output on our mesh. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to start by creating the kind of threads that we're going to see across our material here that are just kind of represent our yarn ball. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Fibres, if I spell it the non-Canadian way, and I'm going to use a Fibres 1. And I'm going to plug this guy in to our normal and our height. And so we're not going to see too much showing up on our mesh here. And that's because I want to go up to our materials, defaults, and edit. And this is going to give us our height for our parallax occlusion. And if we crank this up, we're not going to see too much right now because we have such a large image mapping across our entire material here, or our mesh. So on our fibers, I want to come down and I just want to bump up the tiling. And now you're going to see that we're getting some information, some height and normal information. And it's not very easy to see, so I want to just come to our normal map, and I want to set this up to something like 5 for now. So we get a much more sharp or crisp looking normal map so that we can easily identify where our threads are. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take off all of the tiling that we're going to get on our fibers here, and I just want to have one individual strand. So what I'm going to do in our fibers node here is I'm going to come up to our tiling mode. I'm going to hit absolute, and I'm going to come down to horizontal tiling, and you're going to see it's going to tile across our texture horizontally, and it's going to be seamless across the edge of our texture set. And if we take a look here, we're going to get our thread just tiling right across the center. And so now we're getting this little kind of lump in the middle of our texture here, and if we take a look, it's because we have such a white value compared to the background, which is very black. So the black and the white are contrasting each other, giving us this kind of hump right in the middle of our thread. So in order to kind of fix that a little bit in our viewport, I'm going to add a histogram range. And so what this is going to do is give us more control over our height input so that we can kind of dictate or indicate the range that we want to have between our values, and then shift those values in relation to each other. So if we come down to our range and we come and look in our parameters down here, you can see it's already changed the value of our fibers. And if we shift the range down, it's going to be less contrasting. Inversely shifting it up is going to make it more contrasting. So if we bring this down to 0.5 again, and we take a look at the position, if I bring the position up, it's going to take the values and move them up or brighten them equally or uniformly. And if I bring it down, it will make our entire texture darker, again uniformly, using the range that we indicate. And again, we can play with the range, making it more contrasting or less contrasting. And I'll bring these back up to the center. And I think for this, I'm going to decrease our range a little bit so that it's a little bit flatter, I guess, or that we don't get a hump right down the middle. And I'm going to bring the position up just so that it's kind of an off gray, kind of getting closer to white. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go and create the little fibers that we're going to get on our material here. So how we're going to do that is we're going to add a fur. And from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a blend on top of our initial thread here, and I'm going to plug the fur on top in our foreground. And now if you take a look, it's going to show all of our fur here, and that's because we need to indicate to our blend what kind of blending mode we want to basically overlay this pattern on top of our fibers. So if we come down and we go down to soft light, you can see that it's going to overlay over top, but also kind of stick out a little bit and protrude, kind of making it look like there's some wispy fibers hanging off of our thread here. And so now that we've done that, we're going to get just a little bit of a banding issue or a contrasting issue just because of the fibers node that we have. So I'm going to take our blend here, and on our fibers, I'm just going to add a blur node just to blur out a little bit of the contrasting line that we get. And so now, if I bring the intensity right down, we should get no real contrasting issues there. But now if we look at our thread here, the fibers are a little too big, and I don't want them to run perpendicular to our thread. I want them to run kind of along or at a diagonal along our thread, like our thread is made of very, very fine and spindly fibers. So how we're going to do that is on our fur here, we're going to add a safe transform grayscale node. And so what we're going to do first is come down to where we have rotation, and we're just going to do 90 degrees. And you can see already it's going to take all of our fibers and just turn them 90 degrees so that it's going in the same direction as our thread here. Now they look a little too big and a little bit unorganized, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our safe transform and I'm just going to tile it up so that it's a little bit noisier. And something around 6 looks pretty good. And now what we're going to get is our threads or our fibers or fur here being a little bit too far outside of the range that we want it to be. And you can see the little tiny bumps here of our thread, but our fibers are hanging just outside of where we want them to be. And so in order to fix that, I'm going to come down and I'm going to go to our blur here, and I'm just going to use our blur as the input for our blend. So now we're going to get the fibers just kind of running across our blend parallel to the way that our thread is running. And that's looking pretty good. I think that the fur is a little too harsh though. So I'm going to go to our blend still, and I'm just going to dial back the opacity just to something that allows us to still see the thread. And maybe our blur is a little too strong, so I'm going to bring this down as well. Just enough so that we get some more definition, but we don't get that nice contrasting issue there. And bringing up our fibers once again. And even playing with our histogram range down here. Maybe contrasting it a little bit more. And so now that we've created our base thread, we have to scatter it around our material to create the kind of yarn ball effect where we get the threads wrapping around each other and going in and out of other threads or other threads in the chain. So we actually have one node that can do all of that, and it is the Splatter circular node. So I'm going to take these guys back. And on our blend here, I'm going to add a Splatter circular. And we want to make sure that it is plugged into our pattern input here. And we want to make sure that in our Splatter circular, we go down to where it says pattern, and we want to hit image input. So now it's going to put our little fibers, our little threads, in a circle. It's just going to kind of splatter them onto our texture here and just put them in a radial formation. So what we want to do is we want to come up to where we get our initial parameters here. We can just close off our pattern tab because I don't think we're going to need that. So if we play around with our pattern input or our pattern amount, you can see that we can increase and decrease the amount of our patterns in our circle here. We can also come down to our ring amount, and we can indicate how many rings we want to have of our pattern kind of looping into each other. So I'll put this down to 2 for now, and I'm going to bring this just down to 10 for our pattern amount. So if we scroll down to position, we get our radius, which we can move our radius smaller or we can make it larger to the point where it now starts to tile over the texture set. And you can see when I play with the radius here, once we get to about 0.5, we've hit the edge of our texture set. And I'm going to set this up all the way to 1 so that the pattern is repeating over itself, and we're getting just kind of a bit of randomness in our texture here. And you can see on our material, it's going to just have some random fibers all thrown about. Now I'm going to come down to our angle random, and this is just going to turn some of our circles or our rings and just rotate them randomly. So now that we're done with position, we can close this up. And we want to affect kind of the size of our pattern that's being input here, because you can see we're getting this kind of small little straw looking image in our texture here, and that's not indicative of our initial texture, our initial fiber that we've input. So I want to change the X scale, and I'm going to bring that all the way up. And you're going to see that the fibers are now going to wrap around the texture set and warp and tile across the seams. And we're going to get this kind of looping wires or looping fibers here. If I hit F to zoom back, we're going to get our threads just wrapping around, and we're going to get the start of what our yarn ball is going to be. I also want to change the Y scale just slightly so that we're not getting these very, very sharp threads here. So if we go to our Y and we just bump that up a little bit too, we're going to start to get some of the fur detail that we had indicated in our initial thread here. And we're going to get some of that information back. So I'm going to put that up to 0.5. And now you can see kind of the basis of what our yarn ball is going to be. And just by playing around with some of these parameters, we can get that full effect. So I'm going to come down to our rotation. And again, you can just play around with the different rotations to see what effect it's going to give our yarn here. And you may find that, oh no, I don't like some of these fibers because they're too close and they look like they were procedurally made. So if we come and just change the rotation a little bit, you're able to break up that monotony and add a little bit of randomness to your material. I'm also going to come down to ring rotation just to give a little bit more variety to our material here. And now I'm going to come down to color. And how we're going to use the color is to indicate that we have different layers of yarn wrapping around itself, so that we have some yarn that's a little bit underneath our fibers and some yarn that's over top on our surface level of the yarn. So how we're going to do that is we're going to do luminance by pattern number. And so it's going to take the ring amounts that we indicated up at the top here, if we take a look, and we've set them to 2, and it's going to take their second ring, which was on the inside of our larger ring, and it's just going to scale that luminance value down by that ring number. And you can see if I start to drag this up, we're going to get some yarn kind of getting a little bit darker. And our normal map is going to interpret this as being lower or underneath our lighter valued threads. So if we bump this up, and we also play around with our histogram here, again increasing the range, you can see that we're getting some yarn that kind of looks like it's going underneath threads, and some of the thread is going over top. Now it isn't perfect, as you can see. We get some areas in here that kind of go through each other, but we're going to continuously wrap around and add a bunch of threads onto our material here, and it's going to kind of hide or mask off some of that effect. So if I go back to our splatter circular here, and we come up to our pattern amount and our ring amount again, if I just bump up our ring amount, you can see that it's going to add a bunch of threads. And if we do the same for our ring amount, it's just going to add that many more. So playing around with these values until you get something that looks good is really the simplest way to achieve kind of the yarn that you're looking for. And now if we take a look at our texture set here, you can see that we're still getting a bit of a circular kind of shape. And if we take a look at our texture here, you can kind of see the circular or radial effect that it's having. So in order to kind of fix that up a little bit, we go down into our position tab here, and we just kind of bring up the spread. And then we also want to bring up the offset as well, just to really randomize some of the fibers. And again, you don't want to crank it up too much, because you can see that we're getting kind of like a grid. So we want to bring that down just a little bit. And then playing around with the global offset as well, just to randomize it just a little bit more. And so that's looking a lot better. However, we're still getting some areas where it's just completely black, and that is going to just be completely flat or very blurred on our texture here. So what I want to do is I want to go up, and I just want to play around with the ring amounts as well, just to make sure that we get pretty much all of our black spots covered. And something like that looks pretty good. So now it looks like we've got a ball that's been completely covered in yarn. So now that we've got the basic geometry of our yarn done, we can go ahead and get rid of our base material and start plugging our outputs into the sockets. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that guy. And I'm going to start by placing our normal in the output socket there. And I'm going to take our height and place it down into our height. And so if I right click in our graph and go to view outputs in 3D, now we're going to see the final outputs of our material. So you can see right now we've got a very shiny black ball, and I'm just going to add a uniform color for right now and plug that into our roughness. I'm just going to go over and switch it to grayscale, and I'm just going to bring that up a little bit so that we don't have a very glossy material, because yarn is not very glossy. So what we want to start doing is creating our base color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient map. And what I'm going to plug into this first is our splatter color here. And so what this gradient map is going to do is allow us to colorize our material here based off of grayscale values. And so if we click on our gradient editor and we click on our linear graph here, you can see that if I drag our white value down, it's going to work just like a levels node would. And that's because I'm playing around with our lighter values, which is the right end of our spectrum here, and the color is white. So if I click on this guy and I go into our graph here and click on any other color, you can see now that I'm playing with our lighter values and just pumping up the color that we've indicated we want our lighter values to be. So I'm going to put that back down, and I'm going to bring this to a nice kind of blue color. And now with our darker areas, you can see that we've indicated it's black just based off of default. And in our darker areas in our texture, it's going to start to bump them up like it would in a levels node again. So you can see that we get this almost fake ambient occlusion where we start to erase some of the lower valued material or the threads. And you can see it gets to the point where we no longer have any information. So I'm going to bring that down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click right beside our high value just so that we get the same color, and I'm going to make that a little bit darker. And so I'm going to bring this guy all the way down, and I'm just going to make it a little bit more darker, just kind of an off black, but we don't want to have any real black parts because that is going to be run by our ambient occlusion map. So with our black node here, I'm just going to click it and then drag it up while holding it, and it will just get rid of it. So now you can see when we zoom in, we've got some nice darker blue values, and if we pump it up, it's going to pretty much eliminate all of the lighter values that we have. So I'm going to bring that guy up just a little bit and taking a look. And that looks pretty good. So I want to plug that guy in, and I just want to see what it looks like on our material, because nothing is ever set in stone until it looks good on your mesh. So that doesn't look too bad. But now we can see that our height has been really contrasted again, just from plugging it into our height output versus our height output on our base material. So now if I come down to our histogram range here, and I'm just going to play around with our contrast. I'll bring that down just a little bit and bring our range back up. So now we're going to get something that looks a little bit nicer. And so now one of the outputs that we're missing is our ambient occlusion to give us the shadowing that we're going to need, just because we have some nice areas that will be heavily occluded by most of the light. So in order to get that, we need to come down to the bottom here, and we just need to type output. And so we come up to our usage over here, and we just need to click add item, and we need to come down to where it says ambient occlusion. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'll paste it up here. Call this ambient occlusion for us to be able to see on our node. And then we also want to make sure that we set this to our material group. So if I right click now and view outputs in 3D, you can see that nothing is going to show up because we don't have anything plugged into our ambient occlusion, And that's reading it as that it's completely shadowed because there's no detail or no information for it to read. So what I'm going to do is type in an ambient occlusion, and I'm going to plug that in. So now it's going to give us no shadow detail, no highlight detail. The first thing that I want to do on our ambient occlusion here is come down to where it says GPU optimization to drastically reduce the load time for this node. So now that we've got that, I want to take our histogram range here for our height, and I want to plug that guy directly into our ambient occlusion. And you can see that if I take it out and add it, we get some ambient occlusion in the more recessed areas of our material here. And it's going to really make all of the geometry pop because we have some shadowing detail. Now it's a little too harsh, and so what we have to do is come into our parameters, and we want to bring the height depth down, because if we bring this right up, it's basically saying to increase the range of our material to make it like it's a much larger recessed area, like it's deeper into our material. And so we want to bring that down because we know it's not very far from one of our threads to the other. It's just a yarn ball, so there's not a lot of distance between each thread. So if we bring our height depth down, maybe just up a little bit, you can see that we're starting to get a nice ambient occlusion effect. And again, if I take it out and put it back in, you can see it's a very subtle effect. And with ambient occlusion, you don't want it to be very pronounced or blown out because it's going to make your materials look kind of fake and very dark. And it's going to hide a lot of the color information and the normal information that you've so lovingly put into your material. So now I'm going to come up to our roughness, and I'm going to just take out that uniform color. So now we're going to get a very glossy and wet looking yarn material. And if that's what you're going for, then congratulations, you've done the tutorial. But I want to have it just so that it's got a little bit of glossiness, but pretty much be rough for the most part. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to take our normal map, and I'm going to run it through a curvature smooth. And so when I do that, you can see that we're getting a nice grayscale that we can use for our roughness map. And if I plug that guy in, you can see that it's started to take away some of our glossiness. However, with a roughness map, darker values indicate glossier parts, where whiter values indicate more rough areas. And so it doesn't quite make sense for our glossiest areas to be in the recesses of our material. And you can see here is a prime example where we get a very, very shiny part of our thread right in the kind of crevices or the nooks of our yarn. And so in order to fix that, we just need to take our curvature smooth and we add a levels node. So now what we're going to do with our levels node is we're going to take our inputs on the top here and we're going to invert them. So now that we've got our black or glossier areas on top and white areas or our rough areas kind of in the middle sections here, and you can see now the glossier areas are going to be on top of our yarn, while our rough areas are going to be kind of hidden away and occluded by both our ambient occlusion and our kind of height and normal maps. So now the reason that I used a levels node versus an invert grayscale node is that we have some more control over the total contrast or the values of our grayscale here. So now if I go down to our outputs and I bring up the blackness output, we can slowly eat away at the glossiness of our material. And vice versa with our white output. If I bring this down, you're going to get a very, very plasticky looking material. So I'm going to go back with that, and I'm going to bring up our black value to make it kind of more of a whiter output. And you can see that we've got some light just shining off the ridges here. And the further we bring that up, the rougher it gets. And so I'll bring something right around there just so that we get a little bit of highlight, but nothing too drastic. And so now lastly, our metallic output is the only one that we haven't touched. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to create a uniform color and plug that into our metallic. And just before I do anything, I want to make sure that that uniform is grayscale. So with black, it's indicating that our material is a non-metal, basically allowing it to display non-metallic properties. For any items that were metal, we would indicate it as a white value. And the metallic map, or the output, is essentially a mask where white values are metal, and so it utilizes metallic physics for its lighting and diffusion. And anything that is indicated in a black is basically saying it's a non-metal and to use non-metal physics.